Our non-biblical reading this morning comes from Richard Rohr's book, The Universal Christ, How a Forgotten Reality Can Change Everything We See, Hope for, and Believe. We had imagined that resurrection was just about Jesus, but resurrection is about the whole of creation. It is about history. It's about every human who has ever been conceived, sinned, suffered, and died, every animal that has lived and died a tortured death, every element that has changed from solid to liquid to ether over great expanses of time. It's about you, and it's about me. Resurrection is contagious and free for the taking. It is everywhere visible and available for those who have learned how to see, how to rejoice, and how to neither hoard nor limit God's ubiquitous, that means like everywhere, I had to look it up, ubiquitous gift.
We'll hear the words from John. Early in the morning on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary of Magdala came to the tomb. She saw that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance, so she ran off to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one that Jesus loved, and told them, "The rabbi has been taken from the tomb. We don't know where they have put Jesus." At that time, Peter and the other disciple started out toward the tomb. They were running side by side, but then the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He didn't enter, but bent down to peer in and saw the linen wrappings lying on the ground. Then Simon Peter arrived and entered the tomb. He observed the linen wrappings on the ground and saw the piece of cloth that had covered Jesus' head, lying not with the wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the disciple who had arrived first at the tomb went in. He saw and believed, and yet they didn't understand the scripture that Jesus was to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. Meanwhile, Mary stood weeping beside the tomb. Even as she wept, she stooped to peer inside, and there she saw two angels in dazzling robes. One was seated at the head, and the other at the foot of the place where Jesus' body had lain. They asked her, "Why are you weeping?" She answered them, "Because they have taken away my rabbi, and I don't know where they have put the body." No sooner had she said this than she turned around and caught sight of Jesus standing there, but she didn't know it was Jesus. He asked her, "Why are you weeping? For whom are you looking?" She supposed it was the gardener, so she said, "Please, if you're the one who carried Jesus away, tell me where you've laid the body, and I will take it away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned to him and said, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus then said, "Don't hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to Abba God. Rather, go to the sisters and brothers and tell them, I'm ascending to my Abba and to your Abba, my God and your God." Mary of Magdala went to the disciples. "I have seen the teacher," she announced. Then she reported what the Savior had said to her.
Would you pray with me? Holy One, fill us with the joy of renewal and resurrection. Help us to know it down into every cell of our being, that we might be filled, that we might be inspired, that we might know light in the darknesses of this world. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be filled with your wisdom and your insight. Amen. Roberta was depressed from the time she was a very small child. Roberta Bondi wrote a book called Memories of God. And she talked about her life. It began when she was small, and every summer she would go to her grandparents' house and they would visit a little Baptist church called Pond Fork Baptist Church. And at that church they had revivals every summer. And at these revivals, she learned three very important convictions to their faith. In fact, they were drilled into her. The number one was that she was rotten to the very core of her being and deserved to die and burn in hell forever. The second was that God was so enraged that God wanted to kill us. And third was that in spite of everything else, she learned that God loved us so much that God sent God's Son to die as a sacrifice in our place. Those started to form her early understandings of God. She was raised by a very strict mother and a father who was very critical and very demanding and very controlling. So that she learned between church and home, she learned very early on that there was something fatally wrong with her, she believed. Her parents did eventually divorce, but she figured it was her fault because she wasn't, quote unquote, she wasn't good enough. She continued to have church reinforce the fact that she was unworthy. She continued to hear that rigid theology over and over again. And growing up in the 40s and 50s, she continued to hear language of sacrifice, especially for women, where women were required to sacrifice for their husbands and their children. And you were especially supposed to be selfless. And in that selflessness, you were required to sacrifice everything. And you were required to sacrifice, she said, even for the consequences of their sinfulness. She took it all upon herself. And as a teenager, she was just loaded down with guilt, believing that Jesus had to be crucified and die for her. She carried all of that weight and that depression and that rigid theology with her into a marriage at the age of 18 to a man who was also very rigid in his theological thinking and very controlling. And despite all of that, he let her finish college. She went to 2 years of seminary, and then she did graduate work at Oxford. And she started to get these hints of a different understanding for crucifixion, but they were held in tension with what she'd been brought up with. You know, somehow those things that are ingrained in us when we're little are the hardest ones to get rid of. They get their little tentacles into us, and they're just so hard to pry out. And so she held this tension between, maybe there's another way of understanding this, but I feel like a failure, and I feel not worthy. She had 2 children. Bless you. And then eventually divorced her first husband, married another man by the name of Richard, who was a wonderful man. He was caring, and he was kind, and he treated her like an equal. And yet, despite all of that, or maybe because of all of that, her depression increased. Maybe it just increased the tension between what she'd learned and what she was trying to figure out. So it was the day before their 10-year wedding anniversary when she hit absolute rock bottom. She said she was 47 years old. She said her depression had gotten so bad, it was like she was living in a cave. So she sat in her favorite red chair, the chair that she'd sit in and pray to God, and she cried out to God. And she said, God, I have failed at everything you have given me to do. She said, I have tried to be a loving mother, to be the best mother I can be, to keep my children safe and happy. I have tried to take their suffering away from them. I have begged you to help me love them the right way. And yet all I seem to do is worry more. She said, she was overwhelmed. I have hurt people, I have suffered, my refrigerator is dirty, and my emails are unreturned, and my research is unfinished. I have failed at everything you have given me to do. I give up. I give up. I absolutely give up. She said, if there's something you want me to know, you're going to have to find me to tell me. Because I can't try anymore, and I can't look anymore. I'm done. I absolutely give up. And as she sat in that chair, it was as if she had absolutely given up. That the light of her life sort of went out, and her chin dropped down to her chest, and her breathing slowed. And she said she felt as if her heart broke open, and all of the conflicting emotions and unfinished business and everything that was weighing on her kind of just flowed out of that broken heart. All of the times she tried to please everybody else just flowed out of her until she was empty. She said when she was empty, she felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was as if she sat in that chair, dead. A dead body in the darkness. So she doesn't know how long she sat there. When it was sometime later when she woke up suddenly, and in her own voice, she said, the joy of the resurrection renews the whole world. And she realized in that moment that she had missed the essential ingredient in Christianity. Because the foundation of Christian reality is not the suffering and crucifixion of Jesus. The essential Christian reality is the resurrection and renewal and new life. She said somehow, somewhere along the way, she'd missed all of that, or didn't believe it applied to her. But in that moment of pulling those words from the Catholic Eucharistic prayer for Easter, the joy of the resurrection renews the whole world. She said she knew it in every cell of her being that it was true and that it applied to her, not just to Jesus. And she said as she sat there, she sort of heard a voice saying to her, why on earth do you believe that it is essential to your very existence to please anybody else, no matter how important they are in your life? Don't you realize that I, God, love you without limits, and I will always be there for you? The voice said, how can you think that taking on anyone else's suffering is the way to live your life? How can you think that when you were young and you took your parents' anger into yourself and blamed yourself, took that suffering upon you, did it make your life any better? How could you think that taking your mother's bitterness and grief into yourself and claiming it as your own could help? Did it rescue her? Did it make you feel better? And when you take your child's despair into yourself and suffer for them, does it ease their suffering at all? And suddenly, in that place, she saw her life clearly, in light of this new understanding of resurrection and new life and the love of God. She said somehow a 45-year-old depression ended there. Or at least it was the turning point. Said, everything wasn't perfect after that. But that was the moment when everything changed. And she said she still struggled from that point on to make everything work and everything fit and really own that resurrection for herself. She said, but Jesus was raised with his wounds too. So somehow we have to work through them. Friday night, you brought up. Friday night we sat Shiva. We held space for grief and for mourning and for loss and for hurt. We held that space for Jesus, for ourselves, for everyone who has ever experienced crucifixion in any one of its numerous forms, whether it's violence or persecution or shame or exclusion or ridiculing or bullying or racism. You all can name them. You were there. All of those things. Humiliation. For anyone everywhere who has felt that crucifixion has hung there and said, my God, why have you forsaken me? We held space for that. This morning, we proclaimed that the seemingly impossible is possible. That what seemed hopeless on Friday night isn't hopeless after all. That today, what we thought was the end is not the end. That it doesn't stop at the crucifixion and death of Jesus. That resurrection, however you want to understand that, happens. And in the words of Richard Rohr, it didn't just happen for Jesus, it happens for all of us, for the entirety of the world. We claim the joy of the resurrection for each of us. For any time we have been in that space of feeling crucified by whatever is going on in life. We lift up and proclaim that in the face of violence or from violence, there is life. From death, there is life. From fear, there is life. From exclusion, there is life. What else? Where?
Hatred.
From hatred, there is life. Where else?
Sadness.
From sadness, there is
Life.
What else? From abuse, there is life.
Despair.
From despair, there is, can you say it like you mean it? There is life. What else? From hopelessness, there is life. From anything that can beat us down and stomp on us and leave us lying bleeding and, thinking we're never going to get up again. Whatever that has been for any of us, there is life. Thank you, Shirley. That's what this day proclaims. And no, it's not always easy. No, we don't always have those wonderful turning points like Roberta did. But if we have even the teeniest little bit of hope, look at what an oak tree comes from. A little seed of hope. And we keep trying, and we keep seeking, and we keep asking the questions, and we keep risking, and we keep putting ourselves out there. There is life. So the other thing I want to say to you is that we are a community of resurrection. We are not a community of crucifixion. We are a community of joy and life and renewal. Because we can be catalysts, we can be agents who help in resurrection, who help others to feel renewal and new life. Let me tell you a story. So, Mary and her husband Jim have a little dog named Lucky. And Lucky is quite a character. Whenever they have guests who come for the weekend, they have to warn their guests to keep their suitcases closed, because Lucky is liable to go in and, find something that he fancies and take it and steal it and take it with him to his treasure box, which is in the basement where he keeps all of his toys and all of his treasures. They said, as much as they warn people, invariably somebody leaves their suitcase open and something goes missing, and Mary and Jim have to go down to the treasure box and dig through it. All of Lucky keeps his favorite things, and he always keeps them in his toy box. I wish I could get my dog to do that, but Lucky did. And they find it there, and they bring it back up. And Lucky loved his treasures. Well, it so happened that Mary was diagnosed with breast cancer and was in need of having a double mastectomy. And she was convinced, she convinced herself that it was going to be fatal, that she was not going to make it out of this. And she was very, very down and very depressed. But she scheduled the surgery with a great deal of fear. And the night before, she sat and she cuddled with Lucky. And suddenly she found herself wondering what would happen to Lucky when she died. She thought, okay, yeah, he's okay. This 3-year-old dog is good with her husband, but Lucky was her dog through and through. And suddenly she was sadder about leaving Lucky and how he'd feel abandoned and couldn't understand what had happened. She was feeling sadder about that than she was about what she believed was her impending death. So she had the surgery, and recovery was much more difficult than her doctors expected. And so she was in the hospital for over 2 weeks. And her husband was great with the dog and took him for his nightly walks, but Lucky just was not himself. He was sad, and he cried, and he was, droopy and miserable. Well, the day finally came when Mary came home. And she still was not doing great. She was still too weak to walk upstairs to her bedroom, and so he settled her on the couch, tucked her in for a nap. And she was calling to Lucky, and he wouldn't come. He didn't know what to make of her. He wouldn't come close no matter how she called. And finally she just closed her eyes and went to sleep. When she woke up, she was in a panic. She felt heavy, and something was covering her head, and she was hot, and she couldn't move. And the panic suddenly turned to laughter when she realized that Lucky had gone to his toy box one at a time, and he had brought all of his treasures and blanketed her with all of his treasures, covering her in his love. And from that moment, she stopped worrying about dying and started trying to live. I hope I am not remiss in trying to compare all of us to the dog Lucky. But this is who we're to be as a community of resurrection, to bring our treasures, to help people to live and to have hope. What do those treasures look like? Help me.
Smiles.
A meal, smiles. What else?
Hugs.
Hope? Hugs. Hugs, absolutely. Fine, Shirley.
An act of kindness.
An act of kindness.
Joy.
Joy. A smile. Time. holding space for people, to be present, to be with them, offering our energy, our motivation, sometimes our faith. I'll believe for you and have faith and hope for you when you can't have it for yourself. We're just to be like Lucky, to cover people in our love. And so help in the process of resurrection that is for everyone, not just for Jesus. Because the joy of the resurrection is the essential part of Christianity and renews the world. Amen.